in Islam, mistreating an animal is considered a sin. Assuming that many of those involved in the dog meat trade in Indonesia are Muslims, how do you think in their mind they reconcile this behavior?
Okay, let me be very, yes, in Islam, mistreatment of an animal, any animal, especially making an animal suffer, is as big of a sin that as you can commit. Um, it, it is up there with fornication, adultery, consumption of alcohol. Um, some jurists have even said that it's up there with murder. It's a minority view, but nevertheless a respectable view in the Maliki school and Hanafi school. So that's number one. Number two, there is no disagreement among Islamic uh, scholars and Islamic jurists and all the legal schools of Islam that consumption of what they call it zunab, meaning animals that have fangs, a fang, carnivores, are absolutely, you cannot consume them. It is absolutely prohibited. And the prohibition is as strict as consumption of pork. So to tell me that there's a Muslim that actually eats an animal or a cat or a lion or a tiger or a wolf or a coyote, anything that has is a carnivore, it's as astounding as saying a Muslim that thinks it's okay to eat pork. So consumption, a Muslim cannot consume a dog without incurring a very serious sin. And I am amazed at the religious illiteracy that would allow a Muslim to think that they can consume the meat of the dog. In Islamic theology, we are taught, and when I say we are taught, I'm talking about going through the what we would call the equivalent of seminary system and being trained as a jurist and so on, that you don't consume the flesh of a human being, you don't consume pork, and you absolutely, with the same level of prohibition, do not consume mammals who are carnivores. Now, there's a lot of things that go along with this. So, for instance, uh, uh, carnivores are given a level of intelligence and a level in their nervous system are developed enough where uh, they are supposed to, studying their behaviors are supposed to be indicate or avenues and paths towards understanding the beauty of the divine. Now, when you kill such an animal and consume it, you are severing a path to the majesty of the divine and the beauty of the divine. These animals were put on earth so that the theology teaches, so that we fulfill our obligation to take care of these animals. And in fact, the Quran describes the destruction of animals like that, flying animals, carnivores, animals that God said you cannot eat, as corrupting the earth, fasad fil ard. So, and that's one of the biggest sins you can commit. Now, so this is not even a debatable issue. I'm not aware of a single jurist that says it's okay to eat the flesh of dogs or cats. So this trade is astounding. The other thing that people should know, the very first uh, uh, charitable trust to be created for the caretake of street cats and dogs was created in the medieval era in the 12th century AD in Cairo by a pious Muslim woman. And until colonialism, there was a tradition of building these animal hostels, hotels basically, that where you house dogs and cats. Interesting story, when colonialism, Dutch colonialism, British colonialism, French colonialism came into occupied Muslim countries, they realized that the jurists advising these charitable trusts prohibited the killing of these animals. So you couldn't reduce their numbers by killing them. You can only fix them so that they don't reproduce, but you could not kill them. And the idea was so inconceivable and so ridiculous for the colonial powers that they released the animals from the charitable homes that they were in into the streets, and administration belonged to them, as you know. So, and that started the deconstruction of the tradition of having charitable trusts taking care of animals by housing them. Because I mean, there's a very famous incident by one of Napoleon's advisors upon invading Egypt, who thought that Egyptians, that's why Egyptians are backwards, is because they spend their money on taking care and housing these animals and feeding them. Well, you know, that's not what you do with animals. So historically, Muslims who forget their own history, their proud history about whether, you know, you can keep a dog in your home or not, but the history of that you please God by taking care of animals, taking care of dogs and cats in particular. The tradition, there is a very, the dog in particular, and I'll try to explain this as succinctly as I can. Dogs in particular, in Muslim lore, and you could even say in Arab lore, Middle Eastern lore, were often cast in two nearly paradoxical narratives. In one narrative, they're the friend of the traveler, they're the friend of the sheep herder. The Prophet himself was a herder at one point, like nearly all the prophets were. And dogs were an essential companion. You can't travel in the desert without a dog. It's suicide. Camel and dog. You can't herd without a dog. The dog in Arabic poetry always plays the role of the friend, the loyal friend who's willing to sacrifice the dog's life or his own life to save their friend. But next to this, there was a tradition in the Near East that was always afraid of black dogs, because a mythology that black dogs and the night and things that dwell in the night, the demons, are somehow, for travelers, the appearance of a pack of dogs that are not loyal to any particular human owner, but roving dogs, was always a bad omen, because they were dangerous. They would often hunt in packs. Especially, there was an enormous problem with dogs that became rabid. And rabid dogs, it's not like today where we can actually, you know, immunize dogs and so on. Rabid dogs terrified the pre-modern traveler and the village dwellers and so on. So there was that resulted in a certain lore of dread and fear about dogs. So on the one hand, you have this lore about dogs as the man's companion and friend, and you know, always talking about dogs in very positive terms. But on the other hand, there was that cultural dread about dogs as a source of dread and fear, especially if they become rabid. and they become ill. Now, add to this, in the Near East, there was a rather curious political practice. It started out by the Romans, that when the Romans would crucify their enemies, they would often crucify a dog with the human beings, put a dog up there, pin a dog up with them. And it was a way of belittling and humiliating their enemies. That practice was prohibited in Islamic law, but it continued to exist after the death of the Prophet. The Prophet banned it, but it continued to exist after the death of the Prophet for about 100 years before it was completely stopped. So what I'm saying is that for a scholar who studies a tradition, you can understand where the anti-dog traditions come from, the cultural sense of fear, the dynamics, historical contingencies that resulted in people being scared of dogs or thinking that they symbolically could be a source of danger. But at the same time, you also understand the traditions that talk about dogs as loyal friends and as saviors and protectors and so on. The, the, and I'm not the first scholar who did this, but the scholars before me who studied this entire picture, like a lot of Maliki scholars, a lot of Hanafi scholars, a lot of Indonesians would either be Hanafi or Maliki, some would be Shafi'i, but many Hanafi and Maliki scholars reached the conclusion that even the traditions that say the saliva of dogs are impure, are not authentic and not reliable. And as a result, they said as long as you keep your dog healthy, you make sure that your dog doesn't become rabid, and as long as you control what the dog consumes, so the dog is not eating poop, is not eating mice and rats and rodents and so on. In other words, you control what your dog eats. Then a dog, in fact, can live in your home, and their saliva is not a source of any impurity. So I actually rely on that opinion in my own life. That's why I'll pray. When I'm praying, I'll have dogs around me, and I'm not worried about their saliva because I control their consumption. Now, this is on the issue of ownership. So maybe we can say we have three issues. The issue is, one, can you own dogs? Second, how do you treat dogs? And third is consuming dogs. Consuming dogs is the easiest. Absolutely prohibited. No ifs, ands, or buts. No exceptions. It is one of the gravest sins that you can commit. Second, the treatment of dogs. Any Muslim who bothers to learn their tradition will immediately run into numerous theological treatises that says if you mistreat an animal, if you torment an animal, you are offending against God directly, because that animal was created by God, put on earth by God, and again, so there unfortunately it's violated all the time, but there's no ifs, ands, and buts. The one where we have some discussion is whether how do you negotiate the issue of the debate about the dog's saliva? Whether in fact it's always impure or only impure if you do not control what a dog consumes. And on that issue, I side with the school that says no, it's not always impure, and that whether it's pure or not depends on what the dog consumes. But this has nothing to do with, just because you think the dog's saliva is impure doesn't mean you can mistreat the dog. And it doesn't mean absolutely you can't consume the dog. Similar thing, by the way, as a Muslim, if I see a pig, God doesn't give me a license to mistreat a pig just because Muslims don't consume pork and Jews don't consume pork. I would still have to treat a pig with mercy and kindness because it's a creature that God created. If God didn't want to create pigs, God wouldn't have created pigs.